Mark Ellison was the town's most trusted deputy, Laura Ellison its most admired wife, yet behind their perfect facade lay secrets that would end in betrayal, obsession, and the shocking murder that tore Ridgefield apart. In Ridgefield, life seemed ordinary on the surface, the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked and waved to neighbours while mowing the lawn. Among its residents, Mark Ellison and his wife Laura stood out as the picture of stability. Mark was a deputy with the sheriff's department, a man who wore his uniform with pride and carried himself with the authority that came from years of serving the community. He was respected, sometimes even admired for his dedication and discipline. People saw him as reliable, someone they could trust in times of trouble. Beside him, Laura played the role of the perfect spouse, always appearing composed, kind, and eager to help others. She was the type of woman who never missed a church bake sale or a charity fundraiser, the type of neighbour who would show up at your door with soup when you were sick. To everyone around them, they seemed to embody the values Ridgefield held dear. Behind the neat lawn and the bright windows of their home, however, the reality was more complicated. Those who had known Laura for years noticed the small changes first. Her laugh, once effortless and genuine, became rarer. She seemed quieter, distracted, and at times almost weary. When asked, she brushed it off with excuses about being tired from errands or busy with volunteer work. But her closest friends felt something was wrong. They could sense it in the way she avoided certain questions, or how she changed the subject when Mark was mentioned. There were whispers, not loud enough to form accusations, but soft enough to linger in the air, about the way Mark treated her behind closed doors. Mark Ellison's personality was defined by control. His colleagues admired his precision and his ability to stay calm under pressure, but that same need for control extended to his personal life. He expected order in the home, punctual meals, and an atmosphere that reflected discipline rather than chaos. To outsiders, this looked like a well-structured household, but to Laura, it felt suffocating. She had once been full of energy, making plans and pursuing her own hobbies, but over time, those things faded away. She lived in a house where even small disagreements could turn into long, heavy silences. The cracks were subtle, but they were there. Neighbours sometimes noticed how Laura hesitated before speaking when Mark was nearby. Others remarked on how her warmth seemed reserved for moments when she was alone, never when her husband's sharp eyes were watching. Still, in a community like Ridgefield, people preferred to believe in the perfect image. No one wanted to imagine that the deputy's home could be anything but solid. As the summer approached, Laura seemed more restless than ever. She spent more time walking through the neighbourhood, lingering outside just to breathe in the fresh air. When she smiled at others, it often looked forced, as though she were carrying a weight she couldn't put down. If someone had been paying closer attention, they might have realised she was already thinking about escape. But no one did. The community remained enchanted by the Ellisons' outward perfection. Then came the evening that shattered the illusion. The town would remember it for years, because nothing in Ridgefield's quiet history had prepared them for what happened. Laura Ellison was found dead in her own home, and the truth about her life with the deputy would begin to unravel piece by piece. The perfect picture had been torn apart, and beneath it lay secrets darker than anyone had dared to imagine. The shock of Laura Ellison's death rippled through Ridgefield like a wave no one saw coming. In a town where serious crime was rare, the idea that someone had been murdered inside the home of a respected deputy was almost impossible to process. The news spread quickly, first through hushed phone calls and text messages, then through gossip whispered in grocery store aisles and coffee shops. By the time the sheriff's department made its official statement, nearly everyone had already heard Laura Ellison was dead, and the circumstances pointed to something violent. Her body had been discovered late in the evening. Mark Ellison himself had reported it after returning from what he claimed was a long shift. According to his account, he had come home to find Laura unresponsive in the living room. To the dispatcher, his tone had been strangely even, more like the voice of a deputy reporting an incident than that of a husband stumbling across his wife's lifeless body. When the first responders arrived, they found Laura slumped on the couch, her clothing torn, bruises marking her arms and face. There was no sign of forced entry, no shattered windows, no broken locks. Whoever had harmed her had either been let inside willingly or already belonged in the house. Forensics teams moved in swiftly, photographing the scene, collecting fingerprints, and documenting every trace of evidence. The signs of struggle were clear: an overturned lamp, cushions scattered on the floor, and a trail of blood leading from the hallway into the living room. It looked as though Laura had fought desperately before she was overpowered. The official cause of death, determined later by the medical examiner, was blunt force trauma to the head. As the investigation began, suspicion naturally turned toward the person closest to her. To many in the sheriff's department, it was unthinkable that one of their own could be capable of such brutality. Yet the facts were hard to ignore. Mark was the one who found her. He was the one who called it in. And he was the one who lived in the house where she died. Detectives knew that in cases like these, the spouse was often the first person to consider. When questioned, Mark remained calm, perhaps too calm. He explained that he had been working late, covering a colleague's shift. His alibi was thin, relying only on his word and vague references to routine patrols. There was no partner with him that evening, no dashcam footage to account for every hour he claimed to be away. His behavior did not help matters. Instead of breaking down with grief, he spoke in clipped sentences, as if giving a report. To outsiders, this might have seemed like composure, but to investigators, it raised concerns. Was it discipline or was it detachment? The people of Ridgefield, who had once admired him so deeply, began to murmur. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices coming from the Ellison home the night before the murder. Others admitted that Laura had seemed different lately, less cheerful, more withdrawn, and possibly afraid. For some, the thought that their deputy might be guilty was unbearable. But the more they pieced together, the harder it became to dismiss. Still, there were unanswered questions. If Mark had killed her, why stage the scene as a struggle? Why call it in so openly? And if he hadn't, then who else could have entered the home without breaking in? These uncertainties gave the case a fog of unease. What looked clear at first began to grow complicated, and investigators knew they were only scratching the surface. By the end of that week, the Ellison home had been sealed off with yellow tape, a grim sight in the heart of a peaceful neighborhood. Children passing by asked their parents what had happened, and the adults struggled to find answers. The story dominated the local news, with reporters camped outside the sheriff's department demanding updates. For a community that had always trusted its law enforcement, suspicion aimed at a deputy felt like betrayal. The investigation had only just begun, but already the perfect image of Mark Ellison was beginning to crumble, and somewhere in the wreckage of Laura's final hours, investigators sensed that darker truths had yet to come to light. Detectives assigned to Laura Ellison's case knew from the beginning that the truth would not be simple. As they combed through her life, small pieces of a hidden story began to appear. Pieces that did not match the picture-perfect reputation she and her husband had carried for years. It started with Laura's phone, discovered tucked away beneath a drawer in the bedroom, as though she had been trying to keep it out of sight. When investigators managed to unlock it, the contents opened a window into her private struggles. The text messages were the first red flag. In long threads with a close friend, Laura wrote about feeling trapped in her marriage. She described Mark as strict, cold, and increasingly distant. She confessed that she was afraid of him, not because he had physically hurt her, but because of his ability to control every part of her life. Her friend urged her to leave, and Laura admitted she was considering it. The messages grew more urgent in the weeks before her death, with Laura hinting that she had finally found the courage to make a change. But the texts revealed something else too. Laura had been meeting with a man named Daniel, an old flame from her younger years. He had recently reappeared in Ridgefield, and what began as casual conversations had turned into secret encounters. The tone of their exchanges suggested that Laura was seeking comfort and reassurance in him, something she no longer felt at home. She told her friend that Daniel understood her, that he made her feel alive again, and that he was encouraging her to leave Mark once and for all. This discovery widened the investigation. Detectives began digging into Laura's financial records and quickly uncovered more signs of preparation. Several small but regular withdrawals had been made from the Ellisons' joint account, amounts that were not large enough to attract attention, but significant enough to add up over time. Investigators also learned that Laura had quietly consulted with a divorce lawyer just weeks before her death, gathering information on how to separate from Mark without causing an immediate confrontation. She had been building a plan to escape, carefully and quietly, but clearly she hadn't managed to put it into action before her life was cut short. The revelations painted a clear motive for Mark. If he had discovered her intentions, the betrayal could have pushed him over the edge. He was known to value control above all else, and the idea that his wife might leave him for another man would have been intolerable. His stoic demeanor, once seen as strength, now looked suspiciously like concealment. Yet Daniel's sudden reappearance complicated things even further. Investigators looked into his background, only to find that much of it was murky. He did not have strong ties in Ridgefield, and his employment history was vague. Some neighbors claimed to have seen his car parked near the Ellison home on more than one occasion. The possibility that Daniel was more than just a comforting presence in Laura's life became impossible to ignore. Had their meetings been innocent, or had Laura become entangled with someone just as dangerous as the man she was trying to leave? The sheriff's department itself grew tense under the weight of suspicion. Mark continued to insist on his innocence, but the whispers among his colleagues grew louder. Some said they had noticed changes in him recently, a short temper and uncharacteristic frustration. Others avoided commenting altogether, afraid of what might come out if the deputy was officially named as a suspect. The case was no longer just about uncovering a murderer. It was about unraveling the carefully built image of one of Ridgefield's most trusted figures. By the end of the third week, investigators felt they were standing at a crossroads. Both men in Laura's life had motives, and both had access to her. Mark had the discipline and opportunity. Daniel had the obsession and secrecy. The evidence hinted at betrayal, desperation, and dangerous emotions spiraling out of control. The perfect life of Laura Ellison was revealed to be nothing more than a fragile mask, and beneath it a story of escape, obsession, and impending violence was beginning to take shape. Just when it seemed that the investigation was closing in on Mark Ellison, a startling discovery shifted the entire course of the case. Forensic technicians had been working meticulously, analyzing every surface inside the Ellison home. They examined fingerprints on door handles, smudges on the broken lamp, and even partial prints lifted from a glass on the coffee table. Among them, one set stood out, prints that did not belong to Mark, Laura, or any family member who might have reasonably been inside. When run through the database, the match that came back was for Daniel Harper, the man Laura had been secretly meeting. This revelation threw investigators into a whirlwind. For weeks, suspicion had been circling around the deputy, but the fingerprints told a different story. Daniel had been inside the house on the night of the murder, contradicting the assumption that Mark alone had opportunity. Detectives dug deeper into Daniel's past, uncovering layers that Laura herself might not have fully understood. He had not been entirely honest about who he was. His name was linked to several police reports in other states, ranging from restraining orders to accusations of harassment. Though many of the charges never led to convictions, the pattern was undeniable. He had a history of unstable relationships that often turned aggressive when women tried to leave him. The narrative of Laura's final days began to change. What if she had invited Daniel over that night, perhaps to discuss her decision to leave Mark? What if Daniel's obsession had turned into rage when she told him she wasn't ready to make a full commitment? Detectives pieced together a chilling possibility. Laura, already trapped in an unhappy marriage, might have walked straight into the grip of a man far more dangerous than she realized. Further evidence solidified the theory. A neighbor reported seeing a dark-colored sedan parked a few houses down from the Ellison residence on the evening of Laura's death. When shown photos of Daniel's vehicle, the witness immediately confirmed the match. Cell phone records placed him near the Ellison home that same night, despite Daniel's insistence that he had been at a motel outside of town. His alibi crumbled quickly under scrutiny, revealing gaps that he could not explain. The crime scene itself also took on a new light. At first, investigators had assumed the struggle was between Mark and Laura, but now it seemed more likely that Laura had fought Daniel. The overturned furniture, the trail of blood, and the bruises on her arms all pointed to someone trying to overpower her. Daniel's fingerprints on the glass in the living room suggested he had been inside long enough to feel comfortable, not like an intruder sneaking in quickly. As detectives followed this trail, a darker truth emerged. Daniel had not only rekindled an old relationship with Laura, he had become obsessed with the idea of a life with her. Friends revealed that Laura had begun to express doubts about Daniel in the final days of her life, saying he was too intense and unpredictable. It was possible she had tried to end things with him the night she died. That conversation, combined with his history, may have ignited the violence that ended her life. The attempt to frame Mark now appeared deliberate. By leaving signs of tension in the home and counting on Mark's reputation for control, Daniel may have believed suspicion would fall naturally on the deputy. For a time, it worked, but the evidence was now painting a clear picture of obsession, manipulation, and calculated deceit. When detectives confronted Daniel with the findings, he grew evasive. His once confident answers shifted into contradictions. He denied being in the house, but the forensic evidence told the opposite story. His calm exterior cracked under pressure, and investigators began to see the unstable man beneath the surface. The case that had once looked like the downfall of a lawman was turning into the exposure of a dangerous outsider whose obsession spiraled into murder. By the end of that month, public opinion had swung drastically. The town that had once whispered about Mark's guilt now turned its suspicion toward Daniel. What had begun as a tragedy that threatened to destroy the reputation of Ridgefield's trusted deputy was slowly being revealed as something even more sinister. The truth was no longer hidden behind whispers of marital conflict. It was found in the fingerprints of a man who had forced his way into Laura's final chapter. Daniel Harper's arrest came swiftly after the mounting evidence left little room for doubt. Officers found him at a rented apartment on the edge of town, pacing in a room littered with fast food wrappers and crumpled papers. He was disheveled, restless, and yet he still tried to maintain the calm facade he had presented before. The moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the town of Ridgefield felt the weight of relief, though the sorrow of Laura Ellison's death lingered heavily. What had once looked like a case destined to destroy a deputy's name was now revealed to be the unraveling of an obsessive man whose violent impulses had finally spilled into murder. The trial drew intense attention. Reporters filled the courthouse steps, eager to capture the scandal that had first implicated a lawman and then shifted to an outsider who had carefully hidden his past. Prosecutors presented a powerful case. Daniel's fingerprints at the crime scene, his car spotted near the Ellison home, and his cell phone records confirming his presence that night. They laid out Laura's messages, her growing fear, her hesitation about his intensity, and her attempts to end the relationship. The prosecution painted him as a man who had become consumed with the idea of possessing Laura, unwilling to let her go when faced with rejection. The defense attempted to shift blame back onto Mark Ellison, arguing that the deputy's reputation for control and the cracks in his marriage provided enough reason to suspect him. But the evidence against Daniel was overwhelming. The jury listened as experts described the pattern of bruises on Laura's body, consistent with someone stronger forcing themselves onto her. They reviewed Daniel's history, restraining orders from previous partners, incidents of harassment, and a violent temper that flared when he felt abandoned. Though many of those charges had never stuck, they now served as a chilling backdrop to Laura's final moments. Throughout the proceedings, Mark Ellison sat quietly in the courtroom. Though cleared of suspicion, he carried himself with a haunted expression. His colleagues avoided meeting his eyes, torn between relief that he had not been guilty and discomfort at the deeper truths revealed about his marriage. He had not killed Laura, but the story of their life together was no longer untouchable. The community now understood that behind their neat lawn and polished appearances had been years of silence, control, and unhappiness. For some, it was difficult to separate the tragedy from the man who, though innocent of murder, had helped create the environment Laura longed to escape. When the verdict finally came, it was decisive. Daniel Harper was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps and murmurs, while Mark sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served, but the victory felt hollow. Laura's absence was a wound that would never fully heal, and the truth of how her final choices had led her into danger left an ache in everyone who had cared for her. The aftermath of the case lingered long after the headlines faded. Ridgefield, once so trusting of its own image as a safe and orderly town, learned a painful lesson about appearances. The Ellisons had seemed flawless, yet beneath the surface lay unhappiness and secrets. The man Laura turned to for comfort, the one she believed could free her, became her killer. It was a tragedy built on choices, desperation, and the hidden darkness of obsession. For Mark, life never returned to what it had been. Though he continued his work, his reputation never fully recovered. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with quiet judgment, as though his marriage's collapse had indirectly played a role in the horror that followed. Laura was remembered not only as a victim, but as a woman who tried to break free from a life she no longer wanted. Her story became a warning whispered through the streets of Ridgefield, a reminder that even in the quietest of towns, danger can emerge from places least expected. The murder of a deputy's wife was more than a single act of violence. It was the unraveling of illusions, the exposure of secrets, and the devastating cost of misplaced trust. And as the years passed, the memory of Laura Ellison remained, not just as the center of a scandalous case, but as a life cut short by choices that collided with obsession and ended in tragedy.